Thank you all. I don't know how this is going to go. The first the craft lecture consists of advice for writers given by Tad O'Brien last night at dinner. And it's 4 precepts. One, he was not coached. 1, learn grammar. 2, write clearly. 3, don't repeat the same word over and over. And 4, be interesting. Thank you all. It really is all you need. Now I'm gonna do 2 things, and I'm a little worried about it. I don't really know how this is going to go, and we'll just see. I wrote an essay about the writing of one story of mine. The essay was called "How It Sometimes Happens," but I don't know if reading it aloud is going to be particularly helpful, but here goes. I may cut it off early because it has passages of draft material, and then what I was going to do is read the final thing, not the story, the whole story, but the last part of it. How it sometimes happens. We were vacationing at a resort near the little Irish village of Moville on the Inishowen Peninsula. And on this particular evening, I was feeling something like a ghostly sense of others wandering the air, people long gone whose blood was running in my veins. My whole family came from there. A German got over the wall on the paternal side. That's why the name Bausch. I began thinking about the sweep of time, the trap of it, all these things it would be pompous to say, and still they go through you when, like me, you are inclined always to catastrophic imagining. Fact is, I have come to believe that catastrophic imagination is the price one pays for being a storyteller working toward truth, whether one simply has the propensity in his or her nature, or like me, has spent a lifetime cultivating the troubling matters to make fiction. The troubling of matters to make fiction. Since writing fiction, you are always making up trouble wherever you look. And in this world, really, you never have to look far. Fiction, by its very nature, of course, is about the troubles our existence visits upon us. And if the making of it is to be worth a grown-up's time, it has to be big trouble, too, as we all know. Though the plethora of infantilizing novels and stories and movies with clamorous CGI graphics all designed to hide a stupid story, where what is at issue is always the entire population of humankind, and the battle is always the last, the ultimate, the total and final and completely massive clash of gigantic import, brought to us in the trailer by that voice we all know, in a world. Imagine that guy ordering breakfast. I'll have ham and eggs on this morning. That voice, the latest proliferation of cartoon superheroes and fantasy holocausts, has brought us to a point of some blurring of the lines, and one finds oneself thinking of Chekhov's simple statement about politics that, quoting him, "My politics changes every day, so I must confine myself to stories about how my people live, work, love, die, and the way they speak." We have to remember that it's all about the quality of attention, and sometimes there is much more courage in pausing to lean down and pet a child's head than there is in foiling a bank robbery. So, pondering the hard truths of existence and also trying to savor this fine, cool evening, understanding well enough that if you can live in the awareness of the inevitable common human fate, but make it backdrop, make it something you do not stare at directly, you can find a measure of satisfaction that is hard to describe except in those terms. The deep gladness of a moment that you experience in the full understanding of that very moment's transience. The truest essence, it has always seemed to me, of the meaning of the word joy. But this sounds far more complicated than it was that evening. Simply the unimaginable future was on my mind in that few moments sitting there, watching the elegiac twilight glimmerings in the sky, sipping a crisp white wine, enjoying the peaceful hour. We were far from home, but this felt like being there. But soon, another couple arrived, an elderly man and woman. She was on a cane, and he held her elbow. They came slowly to the table next to ours and sat across from each other. And a little after they sat down, he took a camera out of his pocket and took a picture of her and then put it back. I wondered about that. And I knew almost immediately that I would make a story about him, because there was, in fact, something somber about their movements and a kind of detachment, too. I would imagine my way into their history and write a story that on its surface would be far more objective than my stories usually are, because these people walked into my life from my life and not from my head, and that well of fantasy from which my characters usually come. And in the writing of the story, I knew I would say something about the dream of immortality, that perdurable human wish, since the whole scene had presented itself to me under those circumstances. That night, very late, this morning, very late, I was up working on this, so it's funny. I do so much writing at night. It was 5 o'clock in the morning. That night, late, very late, I sat at the desk in our spacious room overlooking the dark Irish Sea and began writing the story. Now here's the line in the story. 9 o'clock in the evening, and at this latitude, there's still plenty of light. This is a resort hotel in Lough Foyle near the little town of Moville, Northern Ireland. From the wide veranda with its table set for dinner, you can see breezes corrugating the surface of Lough Foyle, which is a darker green than the hills on this side. Two people, a man and a woman in their 70s, move with a slow, wobbly, careful gait, as if the ground beneath them is shifting, and cross to a small square table along the railing facing the lake and the view of the hills. So far, allowing for the tricks of memory, this is an exact picture of what I saw, though of course not quite consciously. I am already making it into imagining, into fiction. They are walking as if the ground beneath them is shifting. I don't know at the moment, I don't know writing it what that means, but I know I need it there. As you can see, nothing in fiction is purely the factual presentation. It is always done in the light of something else, a shadow of something looming over the prose. In the writing, I do not yet know how or why this is the last time for them here. Yet my experience, the years of writing stories, yields up, even without my fully or rationally intending it, the feeling heart of the moment. In the next line of it, I took the step that I always take, the one that establishes things away from my lived life. Near them, a young couple sits with a toddler who sings to himself and runs from one side of the patio to the other. His parents follow his movements, sipping cold beer and talking low about something. They laugh softly, and now the woman calls to him, a little boy with bright red hair and fat little arms and legs. When he's most noisy, the elderly man turns to look at him with a strange half-smile that is in some way almost philosophical. The boy isn't listening to his mother, who keeps telling him to be quiet and to calm down. The young couple and their little boy will serve only as foils for the two people the story is about, although I never think of them as foils. It's all part of the range of being. The change is conscious and fully intended for one purpose, to remove me from the story. I am now outside of it. At some point, the old man looked over at me and commented on my little daughter's pretty hair and exuberant laughter. There was nothing at all philosophical in the way he looked at my little girl. His smile was kindly and appreciative, and I think he used the word exuberant, talking about her. I thanked him. I asked where they came from. He said they'd just come from Belfast, where they had lived for many years. I said we too had just come from Belfast and that we loved the city. He asked where we were from, and I told him Memphis, Tennessee, and they both said they had always wanted to visit there. And that was all. A little later, he took the camera out again and took another picture, and she reached for it, so he handed it over, and she snapped one of him. Then she gave it back. We were through with our meal, and we stood up to leave. Take care, I said. The old man said, I hope you enjoy your stay. Now from the story. Energetic boy, the old man says. Yes, the boy's mother says. I don't know what to do about him. Such pretty red hair, remarks the old woman. Mine used to be that color, her companion says, and one can see the reddish tint of the hair on the backs of his hands. The waiter comes to their table holding menus and asks if they would like something to drink. Can we see a wine list, the old man asks. We're just going to have a drink. Yes, of course, sorry. The waiter walks off. The old man reaches into his jacket pocket and brings out the small camera again. The woman smiles tolerantly at him. Smile, dearest, please. Sorry, she says. Okay, a little further. The boy waits for a little while, and then with an air of someone performing a brave act, he runs his plump fingers along the length of the bottom part of the woman's cane. He straightens and looks at her, as if intending to gauge her reaction or stand up to it. James, his mother calls. Stop bothering those nice people. The boy turns and runs to his parents. Never get over the frank gaze of a child, the old man murmurs. I wish we'd had children, she says. Don't you sometimes? They say so often in the creative writing seminars, show, don't tell, and students, the young and the inexperienced, take it to mean something other than what it actually means. But the fact is that a good story is marbled with exposition when an experienced writer learns to use it in ways that are not visible to the reader. The woman says, I wish we'd had children, don't you sometimes? In my imagining, I heard this now fictional character say this, and having heard it and set it down, I knew that she was dying. And it was then that I became aware, as the writer of the story, that this was a last visit to a place where they had been happy. A little more of the story. They're quiet again, watching the gulls sail and dip above the minutely rippling surface of the water below. God, he says. All right, he tells her. The waiter brings the wine list and stands by for a moment. The man takes time reading over it, and the old man says to the waiter, Americans, about the two younger people. Yes, sir, says the waiter. From New York, they said. Couldn't hear it in their voices. Are you from America, sir? Yes, we honeymooned here many years ago. Celebration then. Knowing what I now knew about the story, I worked the waiter accordingly, and I knew the way an animal knows smelling blood. And that's the way you know. You get to where everything you do is muscle memory in the head. That the waiter's conversation, even on the plain level of service, would contain phrases that would take on a painful irony once the reader was fully aware of everything. A celebration then. This is when one feels the story beginning to write itself. All I had to do now, of course, was imagine a life for these people through what they say to each other. And what sort of life could these two people have had? Looking at them in my mind, I saw consideration and old affection. And now, remembering the actual people, everything's shown in the light of this imagined circumstance, and I cannot separate the written story from the picture of the two people in my memory. Why does a man reach into his jacket pocket, bring out a little camera, and take a picture of his wife in that way with that kind of careful, almost prissy concern? And I recall now that something in their faces made me think of what my departed friend Mary Lee Settle once called the inevitable and the terrible. Because we can imagine something like eternity, we experience this sense of impermanence sometimes as a fright, but as a tragic condition. The mind buckles at the contemplation of stars collapsing, billions of years, infinite empty spaces, time. Shakespeare gone, Michelangelo gone, Beethoven, all the music and the paintings and the books gone. And still, the urge comes to say something, scribble something, tell the story as it occurs to you. Get it down right. Be careful with it. Make it matter. Give it shape. Work it. Make the sounds. And here in motion in my imagination were these two people. And there they moved and spoke, and I listened to them and wrote down what they said. And now it really was as if I was just listening. They talked about old hurts and sorrows, their long life together, and I followed out to her, saying something to him that would be the full essence of the story and the lives. I wrote the whole thing about 20 times, and there were passages, several of which I'll give here, that I severely cut back. He is speaking here. I remember reading that Hitler could be seen as a grown infant, a case of arrested infantile development. There are those stories about him throwing himself on the floor and chewing the carpet in fits of temper, exactly like a 2-year-old. And so the whole of World War II can be viewed in this light as the world dealing with a grown toddler throwing the worst tantrum in history. Yes, I remember you talking about this. I'm sorry. No, it's interesting to me, really. My kindly darling, I'm being truthful, Terence. Imagine a thing so terrible that 1,000 different theories about it can seem true. She nods and sighs and sips her wine, and she sighs once more. Yes, I'm sorry, he says again. I don't think love exists in the general vastness. Viv, he says. No reason to say anything else but the absolute truth as we know it or feel it, she says. You are my darkly brilliant dear, he tells her. She puts both hands over her cough. Every single day has been fascinating in its own way, he says. Later. I want you to change your mind, she says quietly without looking at him. Vivian, it still appalls me, she says. Please, he gets up. We've been through this. I won't be without you. I wouldn't if it were you. Yes, there's no need to keep repeating it. I think we have love in the world because we have death in the world, don't you? Stop it. Poor Terence, but think of it, the cruelest people you ever knew, every one, they had no sense of their own mortality. Their own deaths were unimaginable to them. The logic doesn't hold, Viv. It makes an absurdity. I think if there was no death in the world, there would be no kindness either. I love you. She sets down the glass, then folds her hands around the base of the stem, looking down at it. I used to believe I could live forever, like I would want to. I would want immortality if it was allowed. I know I would want it, he says, for both of us, and I would be kind anyway. She shakes her head. This is nothing but silly wool gathering, I guess, he begins, and then cannot find a way to continue. I wish we'd had children. Do you mean so part of us goes, I mean, I wish it, that's all, for how much more life I might have had. Viv, don't do this. We're very lucky that way. I love you. Don't, Viv, please. I mean it entirely. My beauty, he says. I never liked your singing, she said. He weeps a little, but then he braces himself and faces her and nods. I know. You never quite understood things about me that I hoped you would. I know. You used to say that immortality was not something one could escape, that it's a matter of atoms and molecules. Do you remember? Nothing is lost. It only changes, all that. I was so callow. A little later. I'm not afraid to go alone, she says. I'm afraid to stay alone, he tells her. How many times do we have to go through this? I thought we gained a little peace about it together. Peace, she says. Viv, you can hold my hand until it's over. We're through with this, darling. Please. She takes the last of her beer, and he watches her hunch her shoulders and thinks she's cold and it's shivering, but then he understands that she's in pain, bending over, resisting the need to cough again. Viv, I'm fine, she tells him. He gulps down the last of the beer. She has another sip of hers. It spills over the rim of the glass as she lifts it. Are you frightened, she asks. I'm peaceful, he says. I really am. My stomach hurts. I'm clear of mind and certain, he says. No dread, darling, he says. As I've said, most of this dialogue is finally severely curtailed or cut altogether. And the story called The Same People, which in fact turns on that phrase several times in its final form, was in the Atlantic Monthly in 2010, roughly in the same time frame as my essay, How to Write in 700 Easy Lessons. You put your ass in the chair. Okay, this is how the story ends up. There's a reference to, at one point, she remembers a man taking a picture of her throwing all of his furniture, all of his clothing out in the yard. And they try to remember the man's name, and it becomes tremendously important to them to do. And they can't remember it. Again with a C, Chamberlain, etc. And that comes up, and I don't think there's anything else in here that you won't be. She cries a little and sniffles and holds the handkerchief to her face. Some others come out from the hotel dining room. 3 couples evidently having a good time with whiskey. They're talking loudly about the virtues of different malt scotches. Someone in the bar has prepared a flight, as it's called, of the different kinds. 2 of the men are chasing theirs with Guinness, claiming that the whiskey makes the nutty flavor of the Guinness even stronger. Why aren't you afraid, she asks him. You don't seem the slightest bit afraid. He lets her hold on a moment longer, then reaches down and pats his shoulder and kisses the side of her face. I'm better, she tells him. Please, sit down now. He does so. For a while they watch the others who stand at the railing and talk and laugh and make jokes about something that has transpired in the town. One of the men was in an altercation with a local constable about a broken taillight on a rental car. Nothing I have done or read has prepared me for this, the old woman says, yet I've been thinking about it my whole life. Isn't that remarkable? Her husband nods. He's holding his glass of beer but not drinking from it. Premorbidity. Can you imagine him using such a word? I'm to have very little premorbidity. My entire life has been that, hasn't it? No, he tells her, mine has. You were always in your life up to the hilt. You never gave it a thought. I was the one who was thinking about it all the time and worrying myself sick over nothing, my stupid hypochondria. You talked about it, she says. I kept it to myself. You were the brave, centered one, always. I'd have had children, she says flatly, or I'd have had the one. He puts the beer glass down and covers his face with his hands. It's a motion of great weariness more than anything, rubbing his eyes while the people nearby get louder and more raucous, sampling their whiskeys and seeming far past the ability to distinguish the subtleties of the enterprise. Their laughter rises into the night. He looks up at the stars beginning to sparkle at the top of the sky, the last daylight gone and the moon rising. The light from inside the hotel is all the light there is now. Really, why aren't you afraid at all, even a little? I thought we'd both made peace with it, he says. No, I have made no peace with it. That's your idea of it. He says nothing. Another kind of sickness, she mutters, also long-standing. I don't understand you. What will happen to the pictures, he asks. It's a record of us now for Flo and the rest of them. You are always coming to this, she says. It has nothing to do with my sister. He sniffles, turning from the noise and from her too. But then he straightens and faces her and slowly nods. I know. I always hated it. Yes, he says. You're damn dying. Always you're dying. Please, darling. I wish we'd had our girl. I'm sorry, he says. We don't know that it was a girl. A girl, she says. He takes a long swallow of the beer and then sets the glass down with a suddenness. Cromwell. She looks at him. That was it. Yes, Cromwell. Her tone is devoid of inflection. Cromwell, says her husband. She breathes, coughs, sighs, and then sits straighter as if adjusting to a cramp in her lower back. I want to go wherever there is to go as me, she says, myself. I never would have believed it, and I want to carry my sorrows with me and all my regrets and frustrations and every single minute of every single day forever. If I can think of it, why can't I have it? Darling, he says. I wish you weren't so happy about it, she says. No, he says, you have no idea. I do. I know. I can't help it. He gulps the beer down. She has a sip of hers. He brings the camera out again and can't quite get it to focus. The noise is increasing from the others on the veranda, and someone drops a glass that rolls and does not break. The whole gathering marvels at this as if it were some kind of miracle. One of them, a heavy, shaggy blonde man, comes over and offers to take the old couple's picture. The old man hands him the camera, stands shakily, and moves his chair around to sit next to his wife. The heavy man says, smile, and they smile, and he snaps the picture. Thank you, says the old man, putting the camera back in his coat pocket. He pulls his chair around and faces her again across the table. His wife watches him run his hands over his face. I'll never forgive you. So, and I won't go to the end, because then it would ruin. It's got spoilers. And then I thought I'd just finish. This is titled Finish. The Finish. And this is just a selection from. Now I have time to do this first. I'm going to do just a tiny thing. I'm going to do some of this, and then I'll just do some of this. These are selected Facebook posts. Those of you how many of you are friends of mine on Facebook? Jesus Christ. That's nice. So that some of this might be old to you. I want to talk a little bit about close third, as people are calling it now. Actually, I never really heard that until about 7 or 8 years ago. It comes from Joyce and Virginia Woolf and others. The quickest example comes to mind, Joyce in the story, I think it's Clay, where he says, the kitchen was spick and span, the fire was nice and bright. No words which Joyce himself would use. He's coming through the consciousness of the woman. And Virginia Woolf is just loaded with passages that are coming through, like Septimus in Mrs. Dalloway, who's crazy as hell, and all of his thoughts come through in the narration about him. And it's completely believable and beautiful. So I don't have anything against close third. I use it myself several times, maybe more than several times. It is fine as a fictional strategy if the writer doesn't end up creating a wall with it between the story and the reader. I have this exercise where I say to students, I really will print this essay out, and I pass it out face down. And then I tell everybody in the room, okay, pick it up and put it to your nose. Touch your nose with it. And they all have to go like this. And I say, now read it. And they go, I can't read it. Sure you can, read it. I can't. What do you got to do to read it? Bring it out a little bit. Step back slightly. And that's what I'm talking about with this thing. So when that is going on, I call it too close third. And the thing missing is in every instance of too close third is context. People are moving around and weather is happening and objects are being picked up and put down and conversation takes place. Notice I say conversation, for in stories couched in too close third, you don't get dialogue, you get conversation. When that is happening, the story is devoid of context, or the context is so submerged in daily talk and misplaced detail that it's nearly invisible. This mostly comes from the writer's belief, unconscious or otherwise, that he has to put life on the page, reality, and that ain't nothing. It doesn't have anything to do with it. Fiction has way more to do with itself than it will ever have to do with life. What you're putting on the page is an illusion, a magic show. You get at suggestions of what this amazing thing we have, life, is, but you don't ever finally get it itself. You come close, some people do. What's the line in Our Town? The young woman says to the stage manager, does anyone ever realize life fully? And he goes, no, saints and poets, they do some. And I just love that. But it should have said saints and poets and fiction writers especially. There's simply not enough focus or tension to bring forth drama, much less make the semblances of drama that may accidentally be there. The trouble is that so few inexperienced writers really understand what kind of balancing act close third must be if it's to succeed. Many that I've worked with over the years seem to think, and these are people with, not one of them is without talent. This is the thing that, is so hard about all this. Many that I've worked with over the years seem to think of it as something highly dramatic, and thus it becomes difficult to talk about. They see keeping context back as contributing to the drama, actually creating the drama, the idea being that you keep things from the reader so the reader will follow out of curiosity. I'm telling you, the reader won't willingly follow, because it is finally what the readers know that keeps them reading, and it is context that makes drama. There has been a perception about me as a teacher that I want everyone to talk about their characters all the time and to use exposition alone, and that's not what I'm asking for at all. I have said many times that the truest statement about the writing of fiction is that it's a matter of show and tell, and that the writer develops the ability to know when to do the one and when to do the other, and how to meld them together in such a way that the story comes into being, and the effects of it can be felt rather than merely understood intellectually. I can't tell you how many times reading deftly written stories where I don't feel anything. It's like an intellectual exercise. I get to the end of it and go, okay, well, but I don't feel anything. And I'm not talking about feeling in the sense of the stupid song. I'm talking about felt life, And so I'm not talking about it as used by crooners and all that shit. I'm talking about felt life. As it is delivered in, say, War and Peace, in one scene among many, the little princess has died in childbirth, and they are lowering her body into the ground, and in death her face has an expression that seems to say, I did no harm to anyone. Why must it be that I am put away like this into the ground? And that is sad and awful enough on its face. But Tolstoy has also given you the deeper context, which is that Prince Andrei, her husband and the father of the child, had for months prior to her death only been able to feel irritation when she was near and the desire to be away from her, shut of her, when she spoke. There are scenes showing his unhappiness with her, scenes that also accomplish developing tension about the several other strains of narrative in that massive story. I love Twain's comment about War and Peace. It's the best ironical praise I ever heard. He says, Tolstoy carelessly neglects to include a boat race. Isn't that Twain? It's so Twain. In that massive story, having to do with the growing threat of the war with Napoleon. So in that scene of his wife's burial, we are seeing that expression on her dead face as he sees it, and the context, without comment on it, makes us feel the depth of his horror at himself, while we also experience Tolstoy's uncanny ability to confront us with the remorselessness of existence, with the ghastly facts of material existence. We feel it in our viscera and nerves, and far from the seat of intellect or thought or rationality either. When I speak of too close third as being suffocating, I mean that the writer in the instance about which we are speaking and in the manuscript we are considering has begun to suffocate things in the close third, keeping too much back. Reading the story becomes very much like one of those instances where you walk up to two people in a conversation that concerns all of you and they continue the conversation without catching you up about it. That's downright rude. When you write fiction, you're trying to tease readers out of thought by using their senses, which is the impulse of all the art on earth. You strive to use their powers of imagining, to enter a circumstance fully, in context, in terms of the story's canvas of being, its mystery and beauty, and you can't do it with any one tool alone. And context is not only, or even very often given in straight exposition, it is often webbed into every single gesture and element of a story, and holding on to the deep subjectivity of close third in instances where one carefully placed line would provide context, to neglect the use of that line by its absence makes 15 lines necessary in order to establish a simple fact. Well, then you are using dramatic gesture at the expense of clarity, and the whole thing becomes an attempt to parse out matters that have no real bearing on the depth of the story. Who's who, and where are we, and when are we, and what the hell is at issue, and why has the silence been broken in the first place? My favorite example, and I apologize to my class for having had to hear this again, is in Conrad's great story, An Outpost of Progress, where you see these two men dropped off on this wilderness place, this remote station, and the men on the ship say, "Boy, I don't give them a week," you know. And then Conrad shows the two men walk up from the platform, and he says, "They were two completely incapable and incompetent individuals whose existence is only rendered possible by the high organization of civilized crowds." And then he goes on to say, "Few men realize that their life, the very essence of their character, their capabilities, and their audacities are only the expression of their belief in the safety of their surroundings." And what happens in a very dramatic story following this is that one of the men becomes so paranoid about where they are that he murders the other one. And an inexperienced writer would have 15 pages of trying to show their incompetence and capability, and the reader would be going, what's going on here? Now here's the opening of Neighbors by that writer most often thought of as spare and minimalist, Raymond Carver. Bill and Arlene Miller were a happy couple, but now and then they felt they alone among their circle had been passed by somehow, leaving Bill to attend to his bookkeeping duties and Arlene occupied with secretarial chores. They talked about it sometimes, mostly in comparison with the lives of their neighbors, Harriet and Jim Stone. It seemed to the Millers that the Stones lived a fuller and brighter life. The context is set. From there, it moves to an alternating close third where we see the two people, Bill and Arlene, after being asked to watch over their neighbor's apartment while the neighbors are on a trip, increasingly trespassing on the privacy of those neighbors. As many of you know, the story ends up with the two of them having locked themselves out of the place with the evidence of their prying inside. They held each other. They leaned into the door as if against a wind and braced themselves. So, I think that's all I need to say there. In Hemingway's great story, Hills Like White Elephants, Context is in every single line. It's loaded with context. And you get that great sentence at the end. I've got to show you that. Yeah, I do. That's fun, real quick. I saw a page of Hemingway's typescript draft work on this story years and years ago, a series of paragraphs that showed him working out the last part. And they ran something like this. The page ran something like this. There was a place where people told you what they meant and you could trust it. And there wasn't any lying and no deception, and everyone was definite and clear. There was a place where things were simple and straightforward, and the clocks were always right, and the trains ran on time. He drank an anise at the bar. There was a place where people told you that they want what they wanted, and where you could talk to them and be understood. He drank an anise at the bar and looked at the others. There was a place where you could make people understand what you really meant, and things were simple and straight and fine, and no one wanted anything you couldn't give them. He drank an anise at the bar and looked at the people. They were all waiting reasonably for the train. That last sentence, as I'm sure you know, is the one he used, but you can see him here trying to work out context and solving the whole thing with finally one word. And in the margin, to the right of it, I love this, in pencil, is written, heh heh. So there's young Hemingway, cocky and sure of himself and celebrating a brilliancy which must have struck him exactly as it strikes us reading it. They were all waiting reasonably for the train. And of course, the loudest sound in that sentence is the word reasonably. The use of that word in its place helps illuminate the matters showing forth in all the subtle reaches of the story, and one begins to realize the artistry involved, the care in the construction of the whole thing. The story ends as the man returns to her side of the platform. He went out through the bead curtains. She was sitting at the table and smiled at him. "Do you feel better?" he asked. "I feel fine," she said. "There's nothing wrong with me. I feel fine." And that great irony in the last line, think about it, what's going on there. That's two contexts, his and hers. It's wrenching. It's amazing. And as the greatest stories always are. So, okay. Any questions? There is a question.
Yep. You remember once you asked me, did I remember anything about the writing of my novels?
Yeah.
Can you say something about how we both came up with the answer, no, not really?
Well, for me, it's always been, I can't unthink them. I mean, it's like I can't remember how it was before I wrote them. So when I remember myself at 20 and 21, all of it's there, everything I ever wrote. I can't remove it. It's just there. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know whether you all have experienced this. Maybe it's just something that Steve and I share, probably from too much whiskey. But it's true. The whole thing is very wondrously mysterious to me. I mean, I'm not as conscious an artist as I suppose others are, and then I talk to them and find out that they're doing the same thing I'm doing in a way. I love the story of Howard Nimerov writing Thomas Mann and saying sending him his thesis about the Magic Mountain, and saying his thesis says that it's a quest story, and Hans Castorp is a hero on a quest. And Mann wrote him back and said, "Thank you for showing me my book." And he was not speaking ironically. It's a nice letter where he says, "I intended to have it have the shape of a great opera." He meant great by size, like 5 large acts. And so, I mean, that's Thomas Mann. So, you know, that's why I say just try to be clear. Try to make the readers see in his or her head exactly the image that you want to convey, and stay with that and just be clear. Don't think about anything else. The rest of it will take care of itself. Even Joyce said that. Just try to be clear. So here's a few things. If you don't mind going till noon, is that all right? I really plan on going till about 3. You don't mind, do you? And I'm going to just say out that Tim had planned an exact 45-minute reading, and that nobody I know in that hall felt anything but, God, that's stunning. And when it was over, he went, what? What? It's 9 what? I mean, time was gone during that reading. And it's one of the greatest things I've ever seen. So, and it ain't just because you're my pal. Too many times you think of this work as something you have to haul up out of yourself. You're writing then more about your experience than you are writing with it. Forget hauling anything up out of the self. Think of it as a path. You're just going to go for a morning stroll through experience as the outside weather of the world. You make the path by walking it, and you can walk anywhere, right? Let it lead you. Put down what comes to you to say, even if it sounds wrong to you or off the subject. And when at last you reach somewhere, it will probably have elements of surprise in it. That's good. No surprises for the writer, Frost tells us, no surprises for the reader. Now you go back, knowing finally where it was always leading, and you strive to be terribly smart about the whole thing. Now, instead of using the dream side of your being, you're using the side that figures how to get a door open when your hands are full. So you use all of yourself before it's over, the daydreamer and the one with the ingenuity. It's hard. It's so hard, not because you're not up to it. It's so hard because it's so important to do it right, to get it down right, and it's hard for everybody. I used to pace, near sick with fear, before I'd sit down to try putting something down, anything. I don't know why I was afraid, since nothing in one day's work comes remotely near to defining anything about what you're doing. It isn't even an indication of anything. It is hard. It confuses. One feels uninspired and flat. One looks at a line and it starts to dissolve into all the other possibilities, and we get scared. What if it's like this tomorrow? And what if it's always like this? And this is what frightens you? The territory, the very deepest nature of the thing itself? Of course it's always terribly hard, because it is coming into being, and that is difficult. Welcome to the territory, the province of creation, the cave of making, as James Dickey called it. Whoever said it would be easy? It only looks as if it was easy after you've done it and redone it and redone it again and again, as many times as it takes. It is work. One is lucky to have it to do. You should try to cultivate a healthy sense of respect for it, of course, while also learning to see the plain silliness of being afraid of one little step on the way to wherever it will take you. The whole thing is a lovely adventure. To write seriously and get it right is to remove the walls between people, to break down the notion of others as monoliths of cultural difference. And we are in a time that would have you believe that these walls are impenetrable and should remain so. And therefore it is terribly important to do this work with everything you have and to come to know the world by heart, even knowing that the world may ignore all your hard work. The world ignores many very great writers every day. But remembering all this, also remember that if a work of narrative art or of poetry or nonfiction does not engage and entertain, then it is a failure, no matter how serious its intent. Good intentions aren't enough, and the writer who claims to be interested in managing better human beings is a despot before he ever picks up the pencil, and a fool before he puts it down. So spend the time to make the reading of the sentences and the lines pleasurable. Try to make your sentences clear and lucid. That must be the first thing. Let the other stuff surprise you. If you are striving to be truthful and faithful to the thing for itself, the chances are very good that it will shine as it should with those matters that can indeed bring about something like salvation itself for a time. Because you know all of us who work in this blessed occupation are trying to widen the province of love. With every story, long or short, there is an implied silence that is broken, the same silence that obtains when the conductor walks out and the audience quietens and he steps up and taps the little stand where all the music is waiting. And then he raises his arms and voila, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony comes into the world again. It is the same in its way with fiction, and if you ask yourself during revision, why has the silence been broken here, you can reach into the very center of the story, its heart, and work outward from there. And then remember that the broken silence is your voice going out into the world. And it will still be sounding in these words and phrases when you are long gone. Whether anyone comes to it or not, and probably no one will, it will be there. And so in that one lovely way you are never effaced. You have made the joyful noise. Ask yourself, Do I want to write or do I want to be a writer? There's a big difference. A big difference. If it confuses you, that's normal. If it makes you feel blank, that's normal too. If it seems to flow and then you look at it and what flowed seems stilted and sloppy and forced, that is also normal. It is also normal to have wildly divergent senses of it at different times. It is completely within the borders of creation to have the conviction that all of it is too deeply flawed and riven with your own shortcomings to be anything anyone else would want to see, and then only a moment later to find yourself with the pleasant suspicion that it might actually be good enough to stop the subways. Sometimes you may even have little places where the language is only its pedestrian self and yields up nothing but things, objects, people talking, except this is what novels are made of, and finally you get to thinking of the whole thing as a story, and you start over, getting a little smarter about it as you go, and then even when it is done and there isn't any more you can see to do with it, you still go back and forth, believing on some days and doubting on others, and mostly doubting. That's our nature, and it is completely normal. And this is the last thing I'll say here. Remember that even when it seems most difficult and most unyielding, it is always going well if you are doing it, struggling with it, even struggling to dream up the next line, because it is in that state of becoming. And so what if some of the stages of its becoming are painful or confusing? Seems to me something is lacking if that is not the case. If you are lucky enough to have a place and time to be pained and confused while you give it what it needs to bring it into being, then everything is as it should be. Nothing is wasted. Go on and do the work, which can also mean sitting and staring at it for a time. At the end of each day, one question: did I work? If the answer is yes, no other questions. Thank you.